Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in Science Fantastic, we take your phone calls and also your emails. Some people have complained to me that the emails that they send to me sometimes are not answered, and so I'll answer them all at once. So, let's begin. Well, one recurring theme that I get is aliens from outer space. Do I believe they're out there? Is it a hoax? Is it real? I mean, what is it with all these reports about flying saucers and UFOs? Well, first of all, let me make clear my own position. I think they're out there. That's right. I think they are out there. Sometimes when I talk to my fellow physicists, their eyes roll up to the heavens, they shake their head, and they say, come on, give me a break. Aliens from outer space? Beam me up, Scotty. Well, yeah, that's what I believe. I believe that we have cataloged so many planets so far, 4,000 of them, just in one tiny segment of the Milky Way galaxy. We now know that the galaxy itself has perhaps billions of Earth-like planets, planets that look very similar to Earth. And if you're to believe that we're the only game in town, that we're the only planet that harbors intelligent life, I mean, come on, give me a break. And think of all the galaxies that are out there. Our Milky Way galaxy has 100 billion stars, but how many galaxies are there? The Hubble Space Telescope can actually see about 100 billion galaxies. So how many stars are there in the visible universe? Believe it or not, I can actually give you that number. There are 100 billion stars in our own Milky Way galaxy, and there are 100 billion galaxies that we can see with our telescopes. Therefore, there are 100 billion times 100 billion stars in the visible universe. That's way more than the number of grains of sand on the beach. So, yeah, I think they're out there. And the next question I get from the audience is, have they visited us? Well, that's where it gets a little fuzzy. There is a program called Ancient Aliens. I've actually been on that show a few times. But let me say that there's no conclusive evidence. If somebody gets a piece of hieroglyphics, a drawing of somebody with a headdress, somebody sitting in a chariot, well, maybe that headdress is really a space helmet. And maybe that chariot is really an advanced rocket ship. Maybe, maybe not. You see, science is based on things that are testable, falsifiable, reproducible, things that we can measure in the laboratory. But if you get a drawing from an ancient civilization that looks like an astronaut or looks like some high priest in a helmet, then what is it? Well, it's not conclusive. That means you can't rule it out. Well, who knows? Maybe we were visited in the past, but it's not the smoking gun. So some people say they've been abducted by flying saucers, and so they know that they're out there because they've talked to them. They've been in those flying saucers. My response to them is, the next time you've been abducted by a flying saucer, for God's sake, steal something. I don't care what. An alien hammer, an alien chip, an alien pencil, anything, so that you have bragging rights afterwards. So it's more than just, well, I was abducted by an alien, but I have no proof. No, you want something tangible, something that we scientists can touch. And if you claim that aliens have done forbidden experiments on your sex organs, as many people have claimed, then let's produce some alien DNA. That would end the story right then and there. Think about that. We could go on for the next 100 years arguing about this UFO, that UFO, but the piece of evidence that would end all the debate is simply a piece of alien technology or alien DNA. That would end it right then and there. And then the question is, well, what do I say to people who claim they have been abducted? First of all, I've met these people. They're honest. They really do believe they've been abducted by aliens from outer space. But I'm a scientist. I realize that there are multiple explanations for phenomena. And as Carl Sagan once said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Where is the proof? Now, after the break, we'll talk about UFOs and whether or not alien abductions can be explained. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour, well, instead of taking your listener phone calls, I'm going to answer the tons of emails that I get. Like I said before, we get a lot of questions about outer space, about aliens, about UFOs, so let's take them one at a time. First of all, be very clear about this. Many of my friends, all of them PhD physicists, laugh and snicker whenever someone talks about flying saucers and UFOs. I don't. I keep an open mind, realizing that there are billions of Earth-like planets in our own backyard, our own Milky Way galaxy. And one day we're going to find the holy grail of planetary astronomy. We're going to find a twin of the Earth, floating in outer space, orbiting around another star that looks just like our sun. We're going to find that doppelganger. And when that happens, then all bets are off about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But let's get back down to Earth. One question I get is about alien abductions. How can I explain that, given the fact that these people are policemen, school teachers, Sunday school teachers, for God's sake? They're just like you and me. How do you explain the fact that many of them are convinced that aliens not only abducted them, but they perform forbidden experiments on them? How do I explain that? Well, there are two major explanations. One is, maybe it happened. Maybe they're absolutely right. I mean, can thousands of people be wrong? Well, that is one plausible explanation that I cannot dismiss. But there's another one as well, and that is something called sleep paralysis. Now, let me explain. Roughly 5% of the human race, when they wake up in the morning, they're paralyzed. You see, when we dream, we are paralyzed. That's right. You are paralyzed when you dream. Otherwise, you could act out your dream and have horrible consequences. So, when you dream, you are paralyzed. But for 5% of the human race, when they wake up in the morning, they're still paralyzed. They should be up and at 'em, but no, they're still paralyzed. They have fear that something is pushing down on them. Many of them say that there's an animal sitting on their chest. In fact, during the Victorian period, there are many paintings that you can Google, many paintings showing Victorian women waking up with a gremlin staring down on them, sitting on their chest. A rather frightening picture, but it's quite common in Victorian paintings. The idea that when you wake up in the morning, there's a gremlin sitting on your chest. In fact, when I teach astronomy at the university, many times I ask the audience, several hundred young people, how many of you have sleep paralysis? And I'm shocked. I'm absolutely shocked. About 5% of the class raises their hand. That yes, when they wake up in the morning, they're convinced that there's an animal sitting on their chest. Now, under hypnosis, it's possible to evoke that memory, that fear of waking up in the morning. And some people claim, though of course it's very hard to prove one way or the other, some people claim that that's the origin of the alien abduction syndrome, that under hypnosis you can re-evoke that fear that you feel, the feeling that someone is staring down on you, some kind of alien is staring down on you, and maybe even performing experiments on your private organs. It turns out that people who suffer from sleep paralysis also are slightly sexually excited when the process takes place. And so some of the critics say, aha, Doesn't that fit all the basic ingredients of a description of alien abduction? Well, I don't know. All I'm saying is that there are two possible explanations. One is maybe it happened. It cannot be ruled out, but it's hearsay. We don't have concrete evidence. Second of all, maybe it's sleep paralysis. But then again, no one's ever done a scientific analysis of these individuals. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't suffer from sleep paralysis. All I'm saying is that there are two logical ways in which one may look at this phenomenon. And then the next question I get in the emails is, well, if I believe that there are aliens out there, what do they look like? What kinds of civilizations can they live in? Well, let's talk about what they might look like. First of all, how did we become intelligent, separating us from the other animals here on the planet Earth? Scientists have identified at least three characteristics. One is stereo vision. Now, why is that important? First of all, why stereo? Why do we have two eyes to the front of our face rather than two eyes to the side of our face? Well, think of all the animals that you learned to love ever since you were in grade school. There are two types of animals, especially mammals. Animals which have eyes to the front of their face, and animals which have eyes to the side of their face. Now, what's the difference? Well, what animals have eyes to the front of their face? Foxes, cats, dogs, sharks, tigers, lions. Who has eyes to the side of their face? Well, rabbits and deers. And what's the difference between a rabbit and a fox? Well, when we talk about foxes, we say sly as a fox. When we talk about rabbits, we say dumb bunny. What's the difference? Well, foxes have eyes to the front of their face because they're hunters. They're predators. They have to have stereo vision to lock on to the target. And they're smarter than prey because they have to stalk. They have to use camouflage. They have to be sneaky. They have to know the habits of the prey. And they have to know when to pounce. So they have to be rather intelligent. Now, if you're a rabbit or a deer, all you have to do is know how to run. You have eyes to the side of your face because you scan 360 degrees all around looking for the tiger, looking for the lion. Now, what are we? Do we have eyes to the side of our face or eyes to the front of our face? Well, we have eyes to the front of our face because we are descended from predators. We have stereo vision. So that's one characteristic. The second characteristic that we have is a thumb. We have the opposable thumb, which allows us to grasp things. But why do we have the opposable thumb? Because we used to swing in trees. In fact, our grasp is about the size of a tree branch in Africa about 100,000 years ago. So that's why we have opposable thumbs. And animals can have claws, tentacles, some grasping instrument. That's the second characteristic for intelligence. The third is language. Because the accumulated wisdom of one generation dies with that generation if you're an ordinary animal. However, we have language. We can learn, and we hand that information down to the next generation. So what I'm saying is something very simple. And that is when we meet aliens from outer space, and if they're intelligent, they will probably have some variation of stereo eyes, the eyes of a predator, opposable thumbs or tentacles or claws that allow them to manipulate the environment, and a language by which they can accumulate wisdom and hand it down from generation to generation. And now let me ask you a question. Of all the animals that you learned about ever since you were in grade school, how many of them have all three characteristics? Think about it for a second. Of all the animals that you've ever thought about, how many of them have some kind of stereo vision, eyes to the front, or maybe more than two eyes to the front, some kind of opposable thumb or grasping instrument, and some kind of language? Well, I think you'll realize very quickly that we are the only game in town. And, not surprisingly, we're the only ones that have mastered the laws of intelligence that can create new worlds via our tools and our instruments. Well, let's keep on going because you have sent me emails about science. One consistent email that I get is, well, what are the aliens going to be like? I mean, it's only a matter of time, a lot of people say, that we make contact with them. Are they going to be evil? Are they going to be friendly? I mean, what will happen when we bump into some of these alien civilizations? Well, let me give you an example of how the establishment looks at this. I was on television once where I casually mentioned the possibility of alien life. That, well, he saw me on TV, and he basically said, how dare you? How dare you appease public conspiracy theories and misinformation by talking about aliens from outer space? And I asked him a simple question. Is there a single law of physics? Is there a single law of physics preventing an alien civilization from going across to the stars? I asked him a simple question. Is there a law of physics preventing that? And he thought for a while, and he finally answered, no, not that he can imagine. In other words, it is physically possible that civilizations far beyond us have mastered interstellar travel. There's no law of physics preventing it, except our limited imagination. And so then the question is, well, how far advanced are they? You see, many of the scientists who have that point of view, that they say to themselves, bah, humbug, the distance between stars is so great that it's impossible for alien civilizations to move between stars. They make the mistake believing that alien civilizations are maybe 100 years more advanced than us. To that degree, I would agree with them. 100 years from now, we're not going to be zipping along the galactic space lanes like in Star Trek or in Star Wars. No, that doesn't the way things work. But if you go beyond 100 years, if you go to 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 1,000,000 years, then you begin to realize, oh my God, a whole new world opens up. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour, we are taking not just your listener phone calls, but we're taking your emails. Once again, I get a lot of emails and questions from the audience, many of whom say they're simply too shy to get on national radio to ask that question. So they send me an email. So I'm going to answer a lot of emails in today's Science Fantastic. Well, let's continue to answer some of the emails that I get. A consistent email that I get is about UFOs. Many of you have seen UFOs. You describe them, and you say, well, explain this. And I say to myself, well, I get a lot of these UFO sightings, but they divide up in certain categories. First of all, about 90 to 95% of these sightings can be dismissed as natural phenomenon. For example, weather anomalies is a great source of UFO sightings. Meteors. Every time a meteor breaks up in the sky, you get a flurry of phone calls. Not to mention the planet Venus, for God's sake. It turns out that Venus is the second brightest object in the sky. And if you're in a car and you see Venus over your shoulder, it seems to follow you. That's right. Just like the moon seems to follow you when you move because of parallax. Same thing with the planet Venus. And President Jimmy Carter apparently said he saw a UFO. The United States Air Force was called in to look into it, and they concluded that it was probably the planet Venus because it seems to follow you when you look back and you see Venus hovering over your shoulder. So I'd say about 95% of these sightings can be dismissed as radar echoes, swamp gas, meteorites, weather anomalies, weather balloons, but the last 5% sends shivers up your spine. The last 5% involve multiple sightings by multiple modes. In other words, not just one person saying, hey, look, Martha, I see a flying saucer up there. No. That can be dismissed as hearsay, as being a hoax, as being someone who got drunk. No, we're talking about multiple sightings by multiple modes. Not just radar, but visual sighting. Not just some farmer looking up in the sky, but seasoned pilots, as well as people on the ground. There's several of these incidences, the most famous one being the JAL incident, where a Japan Airlines plane the pilots saw a UFO hovering next to them as they drove off in their airplane, but it was also tracked by radar as well as being tracked visually. So how do we explain that? Well, I think two ways to explain that is, one, maybe they really are alien craft. Who knows? That's a possibility. The other possibility is that they are hypersonic drones. We know that the United States Air Force regularly tests advanced weapons, drones, for example, not just supersonic drones, but hypersonic. That is, many times the speed of sound. They would have the ability to outrace even a jet plane. And so a pilot in a jet plane would think, oh my God, this is an alien craft, when it's actually just a drone. And why a drone? Because many times these flying saucers seem to execute maneuvers that would crush the body of an ordinary pilot by centrifugal force. Well, if it's a drone, then you don't have to worry about the centrifugal force of these motions. And so that is a definite possibility to explain UFO sightings. And then the other question I get from you listeners is, let's say we do make contact with an alien civilization. How advanced are they going to be? Are they a danger to us? Well, I think we look at this from a scientific point of view. We physicists rank things by energy, and we also rank civilizations by energy into type 1, type 2, and type 3. A type 1 civilization has planetary energy. They can harness the energy of the weather. They can modify volcanoes and earthquakes. Anything planetary they would control, somewhat similar to Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon. A type 2 civilization is stellar. They can manipulate the energy of a star. That's right, a star, like Star Trek. Star Trek would be a typical type 2 civilization. They've colonized a few nearby stars. They play with stars, but not much more than that. Then there's type 3. That is galactic. They roam the galactic space lanes. They play with black holes, like Star Wars. Star Wars would be an example of a type 3 civilization where they can literally move planets, blow up planets. They have the ability and the energy to roam the galactic space lanes. And then the question is, what are we? What are we on this cosmic scale? Are we type 1 with the ability to modify the weather? Are we type 2, allow us to modify the sun, play with stars? Are we type 3 that can play with black holes and roam the galactic space lanes? Well, sorry about that. We are type 0. We get our energy from dead plants, oil, and coal. But you can actually calculate when we might attain type 1 status. Get a calculator, do the calculation, and you come up with the fact that in about 100 years, we will become type 1. And so, in other words, we are in the process of making the most important transition in all of human civilization. The transition from type 0, when we emerge from the swamp, to type 1, when we start to become a planetary civilization. In fact, I see evidence of this every time I read the newspaper. We're looking at the birth pangs of the birth of a type 1 civilization. For example, what will they speak? In a type 1 civilization, a civilization of the year 2100, look at the Internet. In the Internet, English and Mandarin Chinese are already the two leading languages on the Internet. And take a look at sports. We see the emergence of soccer and the Olympics, planetary sports evolving right before our eyes. Take a look at the Internet. What is the Internet? The beginning of a Type 1 telephone system. So we're privileged to be alive to witness the birth of a Type 1 telephone system. So everywhere I look, I see the birth pangs of a Type 1 civilization being born. But it's not obvious that we're going to make it. We have problems like global warming, about designer germ warfare, and nuclear proliferation. So it's not clear we're going to make it. And maybe in outer space, maybe many civilizations never made the transition to Type 1. But if they can reach us from outer space, chances are they're Type 2 or more than likely Type 3. Now, I once gave a talk in London on a book tour, and a little boy comes up to me, about 10 years old. A boy comes up to me and says, "Professor, you are wrong. You are wrong, Professor." And at that point, I had the strange urge to say to him, "Shut up, kid. You're just a boy. I mean, how can you have anything to say about this?" And he said, "Professor, you are wrong. There's Type 4. And then I said to the boy, "Look, kid, there's Type 1, planetary, Type 2, stellar, and Type 3, galactic sources of energy, because that's all there are. Planets, stars, and galaxies. That's all there is, folks." But he insisted I was wrong. And then I thought about it for a while. And then I began to realize, my God, maybe he's right. Maybe there is Type 4. What is beyond galactic? Think about that. Type 4 would be beyond galactic. They would be beyond planets, beyond stars, even beyond the Milky Way galaxy. And then I thought to myself, look at Star Trek. On Star Trek, they have a Type 4 civilization. So let me ask you a question out there. What is the name of the only Type 4 civilization on network television? For you fans out there of Star Trek, well, you know the answer. The answer is the Q. Now, if you did not understand which just transpired, then get with the program. Watch Star Trek, and you can see evidence of a Type 4 civilization. They are godlike. They get their energy beyond the galaxy. And what is that? Dark energy. There is such a thing as dark energy. It turns out that about 73% of the energy of the entire universe goes into the Big Bang and the expansion of the universe, and that is dark energy. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. Well, on Science Fantastic, in this hour, we're going to do something different. Usually we take listener phone calls, or we have a guest, some preeminent scientist talking about their path-breaking work. However, what about the people who send me emails? In fact, some of you are a little bit resentful. They resent the fact that those people who are brash enough to record a comment or question, they get on radio, they get their questions answered. But what about people who are too shy? Or some people who are simply too busy? They just want to dash off an email and have it answered on the air. Well, this is your hour, because we're going to answer a lot of those questions. In the previous hour, we talked about space. We talked about aliens, UFOs. We talked about going to the stars. However, in this hour, we're going to talk a little bit about inner space. That is medicine, cancer, the aging process, immortality, DNA. So we're going to say a few things about inner space as well as outer space in this hour. Okay, well, I have a pile of emails that have been collecting dust. So let's take a few of them one by one. First of all, cancer. Cancer is the second leading cause of death here in the United States. But why can't we cure cancer? I mean, after all, we've been to the moon. We conquer many diseases. Why can't we conquer cancer? Well, first of all, you have to realize what is cancer. Cancer can be caused by things like radiation, by harsh chemicals, by random mutations. All sorts of things can cause cancer. So what is cancer anyway? Well, we now know what cancer is. That doesn't mean we can cure cancer, but we know what cancer is. Cancer is damaged genes. Genes which control the reproductive process of a cell go berserk. They're mutated. They're destroyed. These genes, a handful of them, control the way in which cells divide. Because the cell has lost control of this process, it just keeps on multiplying and multiplying. And cancer cells are immortal. That's right. They are immortal. That's what kills you. They are immortal. They just keep growing without end until they form a tumor. And the tumor then chokes off your blood supply. The tumor then chokes off many of your bodily functions, and then you die. That's why you die of cancer, because cancer cells are immortal. So why can't we simply cure cancer? Well, we now realize that precisely because cancer is a genetic disease, a disease of our genes, broken genes, it means that there's more than one type of cancer. In fact, there are thousands of different types of cancer. The Human Genome Project was relatively simple, sequencing the genes of a human being. The Cancer Genome Project is endless. You're talking about an encyclopedia of all possible breaks, all possible mutations in our DNA, which make cells divide forever. And many things can do this. A virus can do it. Chemicals can do it. Radiation can do it. Many things can cause cancer cells to go haywire. Even bad luck, just random mutations, can cause cells to simply replicate beyond control. And so you realize how difficult it is to cure all forms of cancer. Now, ask yourself a simpler question. Why don't we cure the common cold? I mean, think about it. There's a multi-billion-dollar industry out there which cannot cure the common cold, only gives you relief from the symptoms of the common cold. So why don't we cure the common cold? Because there are over 300 varieties of rhinovirus which can cause the cold, meaning that it's simply not economically a viable decision to try to cure all 300 forms of the rhinovirus. That's why we don't cure the common cold. Can we do it? Well, in principle, yes. In practice, it simply costs too much money. Now, for cancer, it's even worse. Not just 300 different kinds of common colds, but there are thousands, literally thousands of different kinds of cancer. And so to find one cure for all cancer is a very daunting process. Now, there are cures, so-called cures, which are being looked at now beyond simple surgery or radiation or chemotherapy. In other words, in the future, we'll no longer have to cut, splice, dice, or poison cancer cells. We'll be able to use our own immune system or use genetic engineering to attack cancer cells. There's something called immunotherapy, for example, where we take cells out of our body, the T cells, the cells that invigorate our immune system. Then we strengthen them. We modify them. We strengthen them after we take them out of the body, and then we reinsert. We reinsert these energized and modified T cells back into the bloodstream, where they can now recognize cancer. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile some of the most amazing developments in science and technology. And in this hour, we're going to answer your questions that you send me by email. Well, let's get back to cancer. As we said before, we know what cancer is. Cancer is caused by a combination of roughly 4 major genes that go haywire. These genes control the reproductive process of cells. Many things can trigger this process: a random mutation, radiation, poisons. But once the cell loses its ability to reproduce, it simply lives forever, reproducing itself until it forms a tumor, and the tumor eventually kills you. In fact, that's why we die. Now, why don't we simply cure cancer? Because cancer is not just one disease. It's potentially thousands of diseases because there are thousands of ways in which these roughly 4 major genes can be disrupted. So it's a very difficult process to cure cancer. Personally, I think we may eventually simply live with cancer, but cancer won't be the dreaded disease anymore. Think of the common cold. We simply tolerate the common cold. We live with it. We don't cure it because it's simply too expensive. And cancer may go the same way. In other words, we may not have one silver bullet that cures all cancers. However, we will be able to cure many forms of cancers, and the rest are going to be harmless. And so they're not going to be the dreaded killer of today. So in other words, believe it or not, we may simply live with cancer, just like we live with the common cold. Then the next question I get from your emails is, well, what about the aging process? Can we really live forever? Well, you have to ask yourself a simple question. What determines the lifespan of animals and plants? It is basically genetic. Genes control how long an organism lives. For example, mice may live on average roughly 2 years or so, and it's been programmed into their genes. Butterflies that you see may actually live only a few days to a few weeks before they die. But the Greenland shark can live to be over 400 years of age. Think about that. This is perhaps the longest lived vertebrate on the planet Earth. How do we know that? Well, it turns out that these Greenland sharks add another layer to their eyeball every year, like tree rings. Simply by counting the rings in the eye of a Greenland shark, bingo, you can then calculate how old they are, and they are extremely old. As I mentioned before, 400 to 500 years of age. And so, obviously, aging is genetically related. So, what is it, and what can we do about it? First of all, the search for the fountain of youth is perhaps one of the oldest searches in all of human history. One of the earliest of all tales written down by the ancients is the tale of Gilgamesh. In fact, you see many strains and stories in the tale of Gilgamesh winding up in the Bible. That's how old this tale is, the oldest tale of all, the tales of Gilgamesh. And he has a number of exploits, but what is his ultimate goal? His ultimate goal is immortality, to live forever, to find the fountain of youth. And if you think about it, that's also at the heart of the Bible. If you take a look at Genesis, the question is, why were Adam and Eve expelled from the Garden of Eden? Well, you may say to yourself, well, maybe it was sex or some kind of crime that allowed them to be kicked out of the Garden of Eden. No, it was eating of the apple. But the apple of what? The apple of sin? The apple of debauchery and sex? No, the apple of knowledge, the apple of science. And then it turns out that the punishment for Eve was pain in childbirth. But think about that for a moment. Maybe there's some truth to that ancient tale. Because why do women have pain in childbirth? They have pain in childbirth because the birth canal is of a certain size. And as a consequence, it means that women have pain in childbirth as a penalty for our walking upright. So our walking upright was one of the main reasons why we became Homo sapiens, why we became thinking people. Being upright freed up our hands so that we can use tools and then change the world. But walking upright has a price, and that is a finite size of the birth canal. And so in some weird sense, perhaps the Bible tale has some truth in it, that the punishment for knowledge was pain in childbirth. And of course, the size of the brain got larger and larger over the last few 100,000 years to the point where it caused pain in childbirth. So maybe there's some truth to the biblical tale. Well, the search for the fountain of youth has been with us for centuries. Take a look at the state of Florida. Why did the Europeans discover Florida? Because Ponce de Leon was searching for the garden of youth. He didn't find the fountain of youth. However, he did find Florida instead. And also in Asia, we have a legend which may have some truth to it. And that is in Asia, in the year 200 BC, the great Emperor Qin unified China for the first time. So all of China was finally unified by Emperor Qin. But even though he ruled the world of the Chinese, there was one thing he could not control, and that is the wrinkles on his face. He was getting old. He was getting feeble. And so, when he became much older, he assembled his princes and his admirals and sent them out on a job. Find the fountain of youth or don't come back. That was the deal that he laid out to his princes and his admirals. Find the fountain of youth or don't come back. Well, obviously they did not find the fountain of youth, and they didn't come back. But what did they do instead? According to the tale, they founded Korea and Japan. And if you take a look at Japanese history, by golly, around 200 BC is when Japanese culture suddenly explodes. It's Chinese culture that suddenly exploded in Japan in 200 BC. So maybe there's truth to that tale as well, that the search for the fountain of youth created Korea and Japan. Well, how do we look at it from a modern day point of view? There's a whole industry around trying to live forever. Much of it fake. However, some of it with a grain of truth. There are several avenues being pursued. One avenue is telomerase. Let me explain. There is a clock in all of our cells. This biological clock says time to die. When a skin cell divides about 60 times, it goes into senescence. It stops dividing and eventually dies. In fact, that's one reason why we die. But it turns out you can stop the clock. There's something called telomerase, which stops the clock aging in our cells. And so they divide not 60 times, but they divide forever. And this has given us a new word to the English language, to immortalize. That verb did not exist in the English language until recently. But with the coming of telomerase, we can now actually immortalize skin cells, your skin cells, so they divide an infinite amount of time. In fact, I've even interviewed one of the scientists who did this. And they say, well, yeah, we can immortalize cells. Now, what's the catch? There's always a catch someplace, because otherwise everyone would be living forever. The catch is cancer cells also use telomerase. It is that potent that telomerase can stop the clock, but also make possible cancer, which of course kills you because cancer cells are immortal. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we're profiling some of the most amazing developments in science, and we are answering your phone calls and your emails. So, one consistent question that I get is immortality. What does science say about the aging process? Why do we get old? Why do we die? And then the question is it possible to live forever with a new fountain of youth? Well, it turns out that a new field is being born, biogerontology. We are now beginning to understand the biology of the aging process. Realize that 10, 15 years ago, we didn't even know what aging was. Well, you just got old, right? But how? I mean, what was the mechanism by which we got old? Well, we now know the answer, sort of. Aging is the accumulation of error. Error in our DNA, error in our cells. It's information loss, which is the basis of the aging process. When cells begin to accumulate error in their DNA, they become sluggish. They don't move so fast. They're not as resilient as they are before. And when you multiply that by billions, then you get tissues. Tissues that are sunken, that are weathered, that are leathery looking, that are not as supple and as resilient as they used to be. And that is the aging process. And then when that affects one of our vital organs, that's why we die. And so then the question is, what can we do about it? Well, there's several avenues being looked at right now. One of them is telomerase. It's an enzyme that stops the clock. You can actually immortalize skin cells by having a petri dish of skin cells, applying telomerase on them, and they keep on dividing forever. There's a Hayflick limit. 60 reproductions, and then you go into senescence and eventually die. These cells are immortal. Now, what's the catch? The catch is that cancer cells also use telomerase to immortalize themselves. And so we have to be very careful. This technology is powerful, so powerful that if misused, it kills you. And so that's why we have to be very careful using this technology. But telomerase was such a great discovery, it won the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize for the scientists who worked out telomerase. Another avenue being looked at is caloric restriction and sirtuin genes. It turns out that there is one method, and just one, of reliably lengthening the lifespan of every organism studied so far, and that is caloric restriction. It actually works, believe it or not. Works every time. You take any animal, from amoeba to worms, to spiders, insects, to mice, rabbits, dogs, cats, and now primates. You feed them 30% less, and they live 30% longer. That's right. This actually works. Now, what's the catch? The catch is that, well, yeah, you can take an animal, like a dog, feed them 30% less, and these dogs live 30% longer. But they get sluggish. Their body temperature starts to cool down a bit. They lose interest in sex. They're simply like a lump of protoplasm. They're not very interesting. Now, who wants to live like that? Humans have not been tested systematically. There are many people who on their own do this. Many scientists on their own want to live longer, and so they restrict the number of calories they eat. But let's take another short commercial break, and we'll talk about the genetics of the aging process. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour, we're answering your emails that I get that are going to be answered right now on Science Fantastic. Well, before the break, we talked about one and only one mechanism which reliably lengthens the lifespan of any animal we've tested, from worms all the way up to primates. Not humans yet, because we bellyache too much. It's too difficult to experiment on human beings. But it works for dogs, cats, mice, spiders, all the way up to primates now. You feed them 30% less, and they live 30% longer. Now, there's a gene that seems to be responsible for this. Animals in the wild usually are starving to death. That's right. We think of animals being carefree, but for the most part, they're constantly looking for food sources. And given the fact that they are in a state of semi-starvation, they have to make a decision. Animals can either reproduce, that is, use their energy toward getting pregnant and reproducing, or riding out the famine. That is, going through a state of semi-hibernation, riding out the famine to live another day. So we think that's what this gene does. This gene is a switch. It switches from either going into reproductive mode, having babies, or saving your energy to live for another day. And there's a gene that controls that process called the sirtuin genes. There's an enzyme called resveratrol associated with that, and that has caused a stampede. Yes, there are many food faddists out there who think that they can live longer by eating lots of resveratrol and sirtuin genes. Well, not so fast. First of all, yeah, it does appear as if there is a testable link between oxidation, which is governed by the sirtuin genes and resveratrol, and the aging process. But is that the fountain of youth? I tend to doubt it. First of all, we've not even experimented on humans yet. Humans live too long, we bellyache too much, and we sue you if they hurt us. And as a consequence, doctors are very hesitant to do long-term studies on humans. So my personal point of view is we do not yet have a fountain of youth. However, I think our grandkids may have the option of reaching the age of 30 and just stopping. That is, they may enjoy being 30 years of age for many decades to come. So it can't be ruled out, the fact that we might be able to live forever. Now, you may say to yourself, when you go to the drugstore, there are all these ads saying, take 10 years off your face, find eternal youth, all these advertisements, and you may say to yourself, well, obviously they're fake, but how can they get away with it? Well, there's a loophole in our advertising industry. It turns out that if a chemical does not penetrate the skin, then of course it doesn't do anything, but you can now make statements about it precisely because it doesn't do anything, because it's probably harmless. So these potions that you buy at the drugstore, which promise to take years off your face, are actually allowed to make these outrageous claims because they don't penetrate the skin. Because they don't penetrate the skin, chances are they don't work. So here's the irony. The irony is that the cosmetics industry is legally allowed to make all these outrageous claims about being young, once again, precisely because their medicines don't work. That's the irony. Now, however, of all the ingredients, there is one which actually does seem to work to a degree, and that is moisturizers. That's right. Moisturizers seal in moisture, giving you the illusion that you suddenly become younger, and it actually works. But it's an illusion. It doesn't work for long. So I think in the future, we may literally live longer because the genes can be modified to live longer. But I wouldn't be a bit surprised if our grandkids have the option of hitting 30 and then simply stopping the aging process. Yes, that is a distinct possibility. Well, here's another email that I get, and that email asks the question, DNA research, are there any surprises? Are there any discoveries which surprise me as we begin to figure out what's inside our cells of our own body? Yeah, there's several surprises. One surprise concerns Genghis Khan. When you look at ancient history, you realize that there's one individual of ancient history who actually changed the course of modern civilization. His effects can be seen even today, and that is Genghis Khan, the ruler of the Mongols, able to create an empire, technically bigger than the Roman Empire. I mean, think about that for a moment. One man, armed with a tribe of warriors that were able to fire from a moving horse, were able to burn down Baghdad, raze entire cities, blunt the rise of the Islamic Empire, and change the direction of human history. Well, anything that momentous must have had an impact in our DNA, and the answer is yes. It turns out that when you are born, half your genes come from your father, half your genes come from your mother, except for 2 genes. First of all, the Y chromosome comes from the father. And so it is not mixed with the mother. And so you are, in some sense, carriers of a gene exactly the same as your parent's gene, the Y chromosome if you are a boy. For women, it's the mitochondrial genes. So the mitochondrial genes are passed down uninterrupted from woman to woman to woman, while the Y chromosome's genes are transmitted from male to male to male. Well, when you go to Mongolia and you take a look at the Y chromosome of the Mongolian people, instead of finding the usual randomness, you're shocked to find that a huge number of these Y chromosomes are the same, which means that there must have been a common ancestor centuries earlier, which, well, in some sense, cooked the books, in some sense, populated that Y chromosome to most of his people. And who's the father of the Mongolians? Well, Genghis Khan. And if you read stories about Genghis Khan, you realize that every time he conquered another civilization, he would inherit the harem. And he had a huge harem. And the harem had children, and his children had the same propensity to create harems of their own. And maybe that's why he was literally the father of his own country. This effect, the fact that populations change rapidly as you look at the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial chromosome, shows that there could be a very dark episode in the history of the human race. That when one population displaces another population, it is the male gene which proliferates, and the male gene of the original population is eclipsed and vanishes, genetically speaking. And so we find this, by the way, repeatedly throughout human history. And it's all documented in the book, How We Got Here and Who We Are by Dr. David Wright. That was a surprise. Another surprise is as follows. When I was a kid, we learned that our ancestors were cavemen, maybe the Neanderthal, and as you go back in history, there was a line, a straight line that went from our earliest ancestors, the primates, to the cavemen and women, to us. Now we realize that's not true. It turns out it's more like a tree with many, many branches coexisting with other branches. We coexisted with the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals are not our ancestors. We coexisted with them. But is that all? If you look at Lord of the Rings, in that novel, humans coexist with dwarfs, elves, orcs, many kinds of human-like creatures. We coexist with them. That was once considered a fairy tale. Now we realize it's in some sense true. Because we have the Denisovans, they are a forgotten race of individuals of which we have no fossils except tiny little bits of DNA and finger bones by which we know that they exist. So our science is so good now that we can even take tiny finger bones of ancient fossils, take out the DNA, and identify races of humans which coexisted with our ancestors, the Denisovans. Amazing. Just like living in the Lord of the Rings, where humans coexist with orcs and dwarfs and different kinds of human species. All of it from our DNA. Well, unfortunately, that's it for Science Fantastic. Good day for Science Fantastic.